you finally decide to make the jump from a mirrorless camera over to a cinema line camera, there's going to be a little bit of a learning curve. There's a couple of different settings, there's buttons everywhere, and some things that had certain names don't have those anymore. But in today's video, I'm going to talk about the 5 settings that change when you go from shooting on a mirrorless camera to shooting on a cinema camera. Now, you might be used to something called the exposure triangle when you're shooting mirrorless, which is comprised of your shutter speed, your ISO, and your aperture. And on a cinema camera, it's kind of the same thing, but it's more like a star or a pentagon. Now, one feature that's going to change between a mirrorless camera and a cinema camera is going to be shutter angle, at least for most of the cinema cameras that are available. Now, shutter angle is going to be represented in degrees, and the higher the shutter angle in degrees, the more motion blur you're going to introduce into your image. And the same is vice versa, but it's going to make your image darker and it's going to take away some motion blur. Now, the reason why a lot of cinematographers and video creators really like shutter angle is because it maintains the relationship between your shutter speed and your frame rate no matter what frame rate you're going to be using. So if you're familiar with the 180-degree shutter rule, which basically means that 1 over double your frame rate is going to be what's on your screen or what's in your image, if you change that frame rate and you maintain the shutter angle, it's going to maintain that relationship no matter what frame rate you're going to be using. So if you're using 120 frames a second, it's going to be 1 over 240, and it's going to be 1 over 120 if you're going to use 60 frames a second and everything in between. The way that you might want to think about it is that shutter angle is more of the equation and shutter speed is more of the result. Generally speaking, it is going to work the same way. It's just a matter of whether or not you want to maintain that relationship no matter what frame rate you're going to be using. Now, you and I are both pretty much used to using ISO as a way of changing your exposure. Basically, what ISO does is it adds more light sensitivity into your sensor to make an image brighter or to make an image darker. Now, gain is going to be something that you might see on certain cinema cameras, and it actually works pretty much the same way. And you might be used to using ISO values between 100 or 12,800, whatever have you. Gain is going to be measured in decibels with positive and negative numbers. But it does kind of work in the same way. If you lower your gain, you're going to have a darker image. And if you raise it up, you are going to brighten up your image, but at the cost of introducing more noise into your footage. So keep that in mind, but they both basically work the same way. Now, when you're using a cinema camera, especially any of the modern day ones, you're going to have something called dual base ISO, which comes in handy, especially if you're used to using ISO values. Now, dual base ISO basically means that it's the 2 ISO values that your camera has where it performs the best at in terms of its noise floor. Generally speaking, I'm not going to get a lot of noise at either one of those 2 values, and at the same time, I'll be able to get the proper exposure no matter what the situation is. Also, on top of that, if you're using an FX line camera and you're in Cine UI mode, you only have the option of the base ISOs anyway, so you're going to get clean footage no matter what, but you do have to use some of the other things in our exposure star pentagon in order to make sure that everything is dialed in properly. Now, the third setting that's going to change from mirrorless to a cinema camera is going to be the word iris, which literally just means aperture. They both worked in the exact same way, they're represented the exact same way, but generally speaking, just interchange the word iris with aperture instead. If you make your iris go up or you use a smaller aperture, then you're going to introduce more light and you're going to change the depth of field into your image. And the same is going to go in the opposite direction, where if you go to f or t 5.6 or f8 or t8, you're going to introduce more darkness into your image, but you're also going to have more elements in the background in focus versus using something like a lower f-stop. Now, those are the 3 points of the exposure triangle, but I did mention that there's a couple of other things that you want to consider when going from mirrorless into cinema. And to be honest, you probably can do the same thing with a mirrorless camera, but it becomes that much more important to dial your image on one of these guys. Now, say you have everything dialed in from your aperture, your ISO, and your shutter angle at the same time, and things are still a little bit too bright. The general recommendation would be to get an external ND filter, which is going to be a piece of glass that's going to go on the front of your lens in order to bring your exposure down to make sure that things aren't blown out. Now, the cool part about a lot of cinema cameras is that they have those things built in. So something like the Sony FX6 and the Canon C70, the Ursa 12K, there's a bunch of different cinema cameras that have built-in ND filters, which means that you don't have to put glass in front of your glass, which might degrade the quality or even give you a color cast which you might not like. Now, on the Sony FX6, it's going to be represented by a fraction, and the higher up you go in that 1 over whatever the number is, the more ND you're going to introduce, and the same is going to be for going backwards. And on top of that, you could also use the automatic ND filter, so that way it adjusts itself on the fly, which is handy when you're going from location to location. Now, what ends up happening when you have everything dialed in, your NDs dialed in, all the other settings are there, but you still have to deal with things being a little bit underexposed? Well, that's where you use a simple technique called lighting. And lighting your frame and lighting your images is going to be essential to bring your work into that next level. Oftentimes, you can't rely on natural light on its own. You're going to have to bring in your own lights in order to manipulate the image to expose to the things that you want to expose. Now, let me make an example. I have everything dialed in, I have my ND filters already set up, but I do notice that I don't have the proper exposure on my subject's face. Well, instead of changing any of the settings in my camera, I'm going to bring some external lighting in there to make sure they have exposure on the things that need to be exposed. And if there's other things in the background or other parts of my frame that also need exposure as well, you guessed it, you probably need to bring more lights. And if you look at any Hollywood movie and most of the films that you're watching, even when things look supernatural, there is some lighting in some capacity, whether they bring in other light or they shape it themselves while they're on set. Now, of course, this isn't necessarily a setting that's on your camera, but this is the fifth and one of the most essential parts into the things that are going to change when you're shooting on a mirrorless camera to shooting on a cinema camera. And obviously, you could buy ND filters for your mirrorless camera, and you could obviously buy lighting no matter what camera you're going to use. But when you make that step up, you're probably looking to make your work that much better, which means that using NDs and using lighting to your advantage to dial in your exposure is going to be a lot more valuable to you. That being said, this is a quick video talking about some of the things that are going to change when you go from shooting on a mirrorless camera to shooting on a cinema camera. Most of these things just have different names and slightly different functions, but by the end of this video, I hope I helped a little bit with the learning curve in terms of figuring those things out. That being said, if you like this video, there's probably another one somewhere over here. I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.